Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's edition of The Heart of CX. I'm Max Ball, and as always, I'm joined by the wonderful Joanna Palmer. And how are you today, wonderful Joanna Palmer?
Well, I am doing wonderfully, Max
I
Ball.
really didn't allow you to have any other answer to that, did I?
Right? I mean, that was like a loaded multiple choice question. So, how are you, Max Ball?
I am doing very well. We're towards the end of summer. The weather is very nice, so it's a good day. And we talked a little about what we want to talk about today, and I'm excited. As you know, as we were talking, we almost got into the podcast before we hit record here. So, why don't you talk us a little, since you're the one who kind of came up with this thread of conversation, why don't you kick us off and talk about what we're going to talk about?
Yeah, so let's talk about adopting technologies in the contact center. And how this topic came to be is I hosted a webinar or was part of a webinar last week where we did some poll questions. And the first question we asked is, are you currently using AI in your contact center? Now, with that, and it being an AI webinar, I anticipated a relatively healthy percentage of people leveraging AI in their contact center and was quite surprised at the percentage that were leveraging AI. Do you want to take any guesses, Max, on that percentage?
That we're actively, well, much as my little tee up for wonderful, obviously, based on what you said, it's not going to be 75% or some kind of big number. It's interesting to me. You're right, because this was an AI topic. You would think people would self-select and it'd be pretty high, but I'm going to say, I don't know, 45%, just because I don't know.
Well, that's a guess.
It's not a right guess, I can tell.
Yeah, so only 9% said they were using AI in the contact center. Now, that said, 73% said they were planning on introducing AI into the contact center, but 9%. And that had me starting to think, I think this is like our fourth, fifth podcast now, Max, since we've started on AI. It's such a huge topic. And as we continue to talk to various different people throughout this journey, I just assumed, since it was such a prevalent topic, that there were more adopters out there.
Yeah, what's interesting is the first thing that strikes me, because this was an AI webinar, um, that 73% planning to, I mean, that sounds like a high number. And okay, people are just catching up, but talk about self-selected towards that. It probably, all the people who didn't attend are going to have a lower intention to move to AI sooner rather than later.
I would think so. I would think so, unless people have already gotten this figured out and don't need these sorts of webinars, which I don't think so based on the attendance for this webinar. So I tend to agree with you there that 73% that are planning on it's probably inflated. Now, I do wonder about that 9% that are currently using AI. Whether, number one, is it really a higher percentage, but AI is such a general term, it's not truly a specific application per se.
Or I could see it going the other way, and I'm using a chatbot that has absolutely no AI in it, but I think of chatbots as AI, so I said yes, even though I didn't have it.
Right. So, I just think about this and I'm like, okay, so why not the faster adoption of the technology in the contact center? And, thinking about my seat from the customer's side of the house, thinking about AI was one of those technologies where it was like, I know I want it, I know we need it, but how do we get started? How do we
Right.
get started, and where does it fall into our transformation roadmap compared to all of the other critical transformations that we're doing?
And I think your point there is huge. And we should probably talk about the transformation roadmap a little bit, because as I bet everyone who listens to this podcast knows, contact centers are very conservative when it comes to adopting technology, with phenomenally good reasons. This is the face to your customers. This is the one place where nothing can ever be afforded to go wrong.
Right.
So I get it. I totally don't argue that. But I think that's probably one thing we should talk about a little bit, is just, how much of this is just the conservative nature of this part of the business. And you having run a contact center, maybe you can start and just kind of talk about, I know you're a little more aggressive than most, but your mindset and kind of the mindset that you saw out there.
Yeah, and even thinking about the transformation to cloud, there were pieces that I even struggled with in terms of, well, here's all the data we're going to need day one in terms of reporting. We have spent years and years and years, decades even, customizing all of this reporting. And how are we going to get that to the business day one after a major transformation? And the answer is, more than likely, all of those customized reports, you're not. More than likely, you've got to rethink that and socialize the changes to the business ahead of time. Just doing a lift and shift of the contact center into a different application, into a different platform, isn't going to afford you the benefits that you're looking for. You've got to plan, fasten your seatbelt, and take off and try new things. And from that point on, it is setting the expectation that things will gradually get better, that this is a fundamental shift. And more than likely, you're not going to get everything right day one. But your customers trust you. They trust the relationship you've built to that point, and will understand if you don't get things right, as long as you're transparent in that relationship. So I do think that it is a matter of making those fundamental shifts, understanding what your true north is in terms of your overall goals, and then moving forward with it. And so, with that, in terms of your fundamental North Star, whether that is driving revenue, whether that is customer loyalty, whether that is operational efficiency and automation in the contact center, there could be a number of various different components that play into whatever that larger goal is, and starting to think about the technologies that will enable you to get there. And I think AI is one of those that definitely makes sense, especially in the year 2021, and what we have seen from the impact of COVID, the impact of more contacts into the contact center, the impact of not finding enough agent resources to handle the volume today.
Well, and I think you're hitting on something that we should peel back a little bit, which is what COVID did to the contact center. We've done a lot of stuff with Shep Hyken, and I forget the exact soundbite, but we had 5 years of progress, and 5 years of technology updating in the contact center in 6, 9, pick your time frame. And one of the points he makes that I think is really important is, not an ounce of this is technology that didn't exist a year ago or 18 months ago. It was just, you had to. And once people had to work from home and had to start figuring out other ways to do things, turned out digital stuff wasn't so bad. Turned out you really can manage agents from home. And it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out, because you and I both have talked to companies where they're like, nope, we subleased the contact center. We are never going back. And others who are, already brought everybody back, and, everything in between. Um, so I guess that's a long way of I'll turn this into a tangible question that you can answer. How impactful do you think COVID has been? Do you think there is a long-term mindset change and openness to more technology adoption, or do you think this poll is showing people did what they had to survive, they survived, and now we're going to go back to a more conservative
I don't
approach?
think that it's a survive and we're sticking our feet in the ground where they are. I certainly, and maybe this is wishful thinking, but I truly believe that people are going to continue to innovate. COVID gave us that time of we had to do anything we within our means to move forward. And so there was a lot of innovating, trying new things. And I certainly hope that taught us that, hey, it's okay to try, it's okay to fail fast, it's okay to continue to iterate and figure this out. Um, with 73% of people saying that they are planning on introducing AI, planning on introducing this new technology into their organization, I have to believe that those 73%, that the majority of people are not just going to stand still, that they have that open mindset of we have to innovate. We have no choice but to innovate in order to stay relevant.
Yeah, I that makes a lot of sense. The fact that that number is as high, I mean that number is almost surprisingly as high as the I have something deployed is low.
Yeah,
Honestly,
yeah,
um, that's a really whopping big number, and maybe I so I'm gonna fall back on a story, as is my want, and this is really more broadly about technology adoption in the contact center, although it has some AI pieces to it. I worked at a company back in 2000, and we had pretty way bleeding edge stuff. We had the ability to use natural language understanding to read an email and do self-service replies to the email or route it to the appropriate person based on the categorization and the content of the email. And I remember, one of the engineers I was working with, and he was like, I don't think he was more, he wasn't like the manager of the group. He wasn't that into managing, but he was the guy. He was the architect. He was the guy technology wise. He was just the guy. And I remember going through and showing him the demo and how important it was that what we did was, it was a demo of bleeding edge stuff. So it was bubblegum and toothpicks, but it was you could rest an egg on top of your little art, your little structure of bubblegum and toothpicks. And he was like, yeah, you're there. And then about a month later, he came up to me, and a customer had blown up so badly that they had the only person who could fix it was, and this never happened.
mm-hmm.
He had to go on site and he had to go fix it. And he came back and he said, okay, you're doing all these fancy demos. You're telling me all these highfalutin stories, showing me all this crazy stuff, making me figure out how to solve all these problems. And then I go to the customer site and it's pointed sticks and bearskins. They're so far behind what you're doing. And and this was 20 years ago. So I guess my question is, are we in marketing on the vendor side, even though that's not my job anymore, but even worse, on the analyst side, uh, are we telling the highfalutin story? And is that good because that helps people find the North Star? Or is it just out of reality for the contact center? And we really are, 74% is aspirational. Speech technology was the big thing that was going to take over the industry in the next 5 years for 20 years, is this going to be the same thing with AI? Everybody has great intentions, but they just don't, there's so many things that can get in the way. But okay, I've just asked you like the biggest question. I think I just asked you
So
what is up.
I want to say no, that is not the case, that AI is going to be adopted in a timely manner. That said, I think, working on the manufacturer side and not living and breathing the customer side, it is a little ivory tower-ish, and I'll meet your story with a story from the customer perspective.
I'll see your story and raise you a story.
Back in 2012-ish, we had introduced omni-channel routing, or multi-channel routing, really, and had started putting emails, web chats, all the way through the same contact center engine. And when we did, one of the use cases that we had was scanning all of the physical mail orders that we received, and we received a significant amount of them. And each individual mail order, when we scanned it, would convert into a new email. And those new emails would be from the same scanning from address, so we knew that they were scanned in, that the CSRs didn't need to respond to them, but rather just key in the order. Well, that was fine and dandy for the first about 6 months after the implementation. Then all of a sudden, things started slowing down, and then things started just stopping. The system would go down. It would go down several times a day, and then it would go down and we couldn't bring it back up. And after many interactions with the manufacturer, they sent their developers to site, again, unheard of, right? Having their developers sit at a customer site. But what we learned from that was that the system was designed so that it would pull back the history of all of the contacts from that same from address. And so what they had designed and how we were using it were in direct conflict. We had over 10,000 contacts from the same from address. And so every time that a contact would present to an agent, it would try to pull all of those 10,000 back. And imagine, 500 plus agents, and these were the lion's share sometimes of the contacts that were queuing. So multiple calls for these 10,000 contacts.
It's so funny to think that the system would expect a poor agent to try to read that, much less get choked by it.
And so when I started talking to the development team, I'm like, what's the upper limit here? Tell me what the limit is. Well, it should really be a 1-for-1, Joanna, one email from one customer. And I'm like, come on now. That sounds like something you just created from a lab. I'm not going to tell my customer not to email me more than once. And let's face it, just that back and forth nature of email. Customer sends an email, doesn't give enough information. The agent goes back and forth, back and forth. Easily, there could be 10 emails from a customer sometimes. And so it just goes to show that sometimes life is messy. Contact centers are messy. And when systems are designed and engineered and technology is introduced, you're not going to get it all right the first time. So I think that that's a really long answer, Max, to your multiple questions there. But I think it is really a mix of figuring out real world applications that make sense at a customer site with AI. And what is the level of effort for getting that right? And what is the benefit for getting that right? And I certainly believe that with some of those advancements within AI, and some of the AI providers, that the level of effort should be relatively low for the benefit received. It's just a matter of jumping in and testing things out.
Yeah, I hope you're right. I think you're right. There's, we've talked about this before, and it bears kind of mentioning again. It's not like AI is
Right.
an
Right.
application or even a technology, because there is language understanding AI and there is process automation AI, and they're very different things. And both, there's other flavors, but both of those things can be of significant value in the contact center on, in each one of those things
Yeah.
can have multiple applications that they're used for. So, I mean, on one level, I get that it could become overwhelming in a snap, but I think having been an IVR guy, I just can't believe the interest in self-service isn't high enough that people wouldn't jump on
Yeah.
that for all the wrong reasons, but that piece wouldn't be adopted. And there are just so many use cases that make sense, and some of the uh, robotic
Hmm.
process automation, the RPA stuff, a lot of that's back end. It's the customers aren't going to see it. So if nothing else, you've got that as a place to play and kind of
Yeah,
try
and I
some
like
stuff and see what
you
happens.
mentioning that AI is not an application, a single application. And so going back to the results and that only 9% are using AI in the contact center, I have to wonder if some of this is a limiting definition of what AI is. And going back to our conversation last week, Max, on real time AI and some
Mm,
of those use cases, it's agent assist, it could be next best action, it could be um, intelligent routing, um, RPA, like you just mentioned. And so, as you think about all of the various different applications that are infused with AI at this point, I would venture to bet more than 9% of contact centers are using some application that has AI in it.
yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point. And I can even counter that a little bit with, I bet some of them have bots that have absolutely no AI in it, but they're like, that's a bot, it must have AI. So probably a little bit of it cuts the other way, but I think it's more. I think you're really on point with that. Um, the so adoption. One of the things I like to talk about is the average contact
Yeah.
center has 20 vendor relations. Um, there is now a bunch of use cases for AI. You run another thing that I think could slow people down is just, do I really want to yet another vendor relation or set of vendor relationships piled on top of that? But what I'm starting to see very real is the contact center vendors are acquiring
Yeah.
AI or partnering for AI and starting, I can get applications from a number of vendors that are using Google Dialogflow, but I'm just working with my contact center. I don't have to add
Right.
I mean, I'm adding Google in the background there, but it's not like I'm adding some, six guys in a garage vendor to make this happen. And I'm sure there's millions of them out there, and a couple of them are going to be billionaires in a couple of years. But so I think that will help with the adoption a little bit, to the extent I can just get it as part of whatever
Yeah, and you
suite of
bring up a
stuff I'm
good
already
point there
using.
because it's such an exciting time in the contact center. And it is that I want that one stop shop. I want that one quote application or super application that can deal with all of my customer needs, whether that is email, chat, uh, SMS, bots, AI, taking a look at that and being able to create that ecosystem and having as few vendors as necessary as possible ultimately is the goal. When I was looking at my contact center transformation, we were looking at AI too, and we wanted our contact center platform to have AI in it. I didn't want that separate partnership. That said, you brought up Google Dialogflow, which is a great example, and more vendors are making that as part of the out-of-box integrations with their contact center application.
Yeah. And I think to the extent the vendors can make it easier to implement, that's going to make it less scary and less, get rid of a lot of the resistance. But I said it before, and I think it bears repeating. With very good reason, contact centers tend to be very conservative when it comes to deploying new technology. So it's kind of okay. I can turn this into a question for you that I don't know the answer to. There is this history of conservatism. There will be the exceptional company that goes for it. Do you think they're going to build a sufficient competitive advantage that's going to force more of the industry to start adopting? Or is that going to be too subtle and they're going to be smart enough to not advertise what they're doing? And although I can't believe over a beer at a trade show, they're not going to start bragging about it. But
I don't definitively know the answer. My gut is telling me that AI is going to be one of those things that provides a competitive advantage. It is the capabilities there, and the definition of AI is machine learning. And that machine is going to be able to take data and gain insights much more quickly, much more effectively than humans. And so it's got to be able to produce a competitive advantage. And whether they brag or not, there are enough companies out there taking a look at this. There may be those that keep it hush hush. There's going to be plenty of those that definitely sing AI's praises, I think, from the mountaintops and share what they've done.
Yeah, and I think and you know what, even if they don't, the vendors are going to start doing it, right? Because I don't care, I don't care who the customer is. At some point, the vendor can say, an insurance company did this or whatever, right? So they're going to get the use case stories out there. If it's a use case that the vendor looks at and goes, wow, I want to see this, I can sell this to 20 and I can sell this to everybody in the insurance industry because they all need it. They'll figure out a way to get that story out. So yeah, it at some point you can't keep those things secret. They're just going to have to come out, and they're going to have to happen.
Definitely. All right. Well, on that note, we've got AI improving the world, that it is going to be adopted, and that people are going to know about it and know about some of those practical use cases. I feel like this is a good point to wrap up on.
I agree. And the only thought I would want to finalize on is if you're running a contact center and you're thinking about AI apps, don't be shy and, follow the Joanna mantra. That's a hard phrase to say, test, fail fast, do it on a small scale, see what you can do and grow it gradually, because there's so much power and so much differentiation out there. I think 5 years from now, there's going to be so many apps that we take for granted that we're just not even thinking about yet.
Sure.
That really make a difference.
All right. Well, thank you, Max. It was great talking with you about this subject again, and I'm sure we'll talk AI quite a few more times.
I'm sure we will, but I appreciate you coming up. This was a nice angle.
All right.
And a good way to think about it. So.
All right.
You too. Talk to you next week.